Hi, good afternoon and welcome to another HKSSC webinar. My name is Aaron and I work for Elevate and we are the HKSSC Secretariat. We're bringing you this webinar today on an open platform. Normally our webinars are closed to members, but the lucky few that have joined today are getting to hear some insights on social issues in the supply chain brought to you by EJF, by Poulson Consulting, and by ITF, and our facilitator today will be Jacqui Dixon. Just before we get started, I'd like to just introduce you to the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition and run through some housewarming before we get into the actual meat of this webinar. First of all, for housekeeping purposes, we'll just let you know now that all slides will be shared upon request, and we'll also be updating our website with these open webinars during the next week. So you can get this webinar plus the previous two open webinars on our website. That's HKSustainableSeafoodCoalition.org. As with all our meetings, whether for members or open, we run these with chat and pouch rules. So anything that's said during this forum we have to protect the identities. So we ask that you don't chip in your questions and assign them to any particular organization. We use the chat function in the webinar platform, and then I will select some of those questions and provide them to Jacqui Dixon for asking our guests today. So with that, just a quick overview of the Seafood Coalition itself. The Seafood Coalition is now in its third year. It's a coalition of industry members. I'm sure many of you have joined our webinars before, so you know this, but it's member-led, and what we're looking to do is improve the seafood market sourcing practices in Hong Kong. So the whole vision of this is for the seafood imported into Hong Kong to be legal, traceable, and biologically sustainable. Right now, we're focusing this webinar on some social issues, but as you can imagine, some of those social issues are closely intertwined with the biological sustainability of seafood that we import. Therefore, we feel it's important to bring this message to you. A quick snapshot of our members. You can see they represent different buyers and sellers in the industry. We also have had a couple of new members come on board in the first quarter of this year, representing different hoteliers and casinos. If you're interested yourself in joining the coalition, you can contact us at the Secretariat. You can see my email address at the bottom of the screen there. So without further ado, I'll not keep you waiting any longer. I'll hand over to Jacqui and she can introduce today's speakers. Thank you, Jacqui.
Thanks very much, Aaron, and welcome everyone to this webinar on labour rights and social challenges facing the seafood industry. I'll just put my camera on here so that everyone can see me for a bit. We're not going to keep our cameras on for the whole webinar, really just to save bandwidth. We think the connection is probably better with our cameras, and also then the slides get maximized on the screen. So this is the second webinar that we've hosted on this topic, on social challenges facing the seafood industry. The first of which we organized in April this year, and you can find that on the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition website in case you missed it. So today we are bringing together more prominent voices on the labour rights of seafarers and a fishing crew, in particular migrant workers in seafood supply chains. Now, while labour rights and social issues do not yet form part of the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition Codes of Conduct, our members are certainly interested in learning more about this topic, and awareness is one of the first steps, and also bringing together experts across the world that are working on these issues day to day. This is going to help us, guide us on approaches to due diligence in seafood supply chains and some of the solutions to these significant challenges that are facing the industry. So today, our first speaker will be Sophie Nodzenski. She leads the Environmental Justice Foundation's global campaign for fisheries transparency. Working with colleagues in Europe, Asia, and Africa, she is campaigning for the adoption of EJF's Charter for Transparency, which are 10 realistic principles that states can adopt to bring fishing out of the shadows, to end IUU and the associated issues like human trafficking at sea. She has been at the EJF since 2012 after completing her Masters of Law, and previously coordinated EJF's evidence gathering of illegal fishing activities off the coast of West Africa, and used to inform enforcement of existing laws and the development of new regulations. The evidence is used to present to governments, intergovernmental bodies, and industry. And more recently, she has represented EJF in a coalition with other major EU NGOs working to improve the implementation of the EU IUU regulation. So I will now hand over to Sophie, who's going to take us through her presentation. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Jacqui. I'm just saying hi on camera, but during the presentation, I'm just going to turn it off as well so that we can maximize the screen. Hold on. So Aaron, I will tell you when we can change the slide, right?
That's right.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, for the very lengthy introduction. So I'm Sophie Nodzenski, and I work for the Environmental Justice Foundation. And so it's a pleasure for me today to present our work to the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition. And I will concentrate on a specific issue, and it was actually just brought up by Aaron during his introduction. And so it's mostly about the synergies between sustainability and labor issues in the fishing sector. If we could move on to the second slide, Aaron. Yeah. So EJF, in case you've never heard of us, we're a fairly small NGO, and we're both an environmental and human rights organization. And so that means that we work on campaigns where environmental degradation affects people's rights and human rights. And our biggest campaign is actually on ending illegal fishing globally. And we work generally in West Africa and East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so today I'm talking about some of the human rights aspects that are linked to fishing and actually illegal fishing, and so specifically on labor and human rights abuses on board fishing vessels. I was going to show a film, but I think we're going to skip that part actually. So Aaron, if we could move to the slide about the vicious cycle. Yeah. So just to tell you a little bit more about the context. So as an organization, as I said, we work globally, and we have identified cases of human rights abuses and human trafficking on board fishing vessels across 11 different countries. When it comes to the link with overfishing and illegal fishing, we believe as an organization that human rights abuses are somehow linked to the plundering of our oceans. And because many fish stocks are overfished and a lot are on the brink of collapse, there is less to fish. And so it means that it's getting increasingly difficult to survive in the fishing sector. And so the idea is that the depletion of fish stocks put pressure on fishing operators to maintain profitability. And to do that, they have to decrease operational costs. And so some unscrupulous operators will turn to reduce their labor cost, as labor can account for up to 60% of a vessel operating cost. And so, yeah, Aaron, if we can move to the next slide. And so this in itself, it creates an enabling environment for human rights abuses and sometimes trafficking. But this is also, so this vicious cycle is also compounded by other factors. It's also the drive for cheap seafood in the global market. So to maintain consumption in the global north, international retailers and other companies are forcing down the price of goods, and so that includes seafood, And that seafood is often imported from abroad, and this is done through reliance on harsh labor regimes in the global south. So that's one factor. A second factor is also the fact that in the seafood sector, brokers have quite a prominent role, and whether or not they are licensed, they can play a major role in the deception of workers and take advantage of them, mostly because a lot of them come from impoverished countries, and they're facing a lack of other work opportunities. And then the other factor, and the last one here, is that workers on fishing vessels are inherently vulnerable. And again, going back to the vicious cycle that relates to overfishing and illegal fishing, because there is a pressure on vessel operators to cut costs, this is an incentive for them to use migrant labor, and they're often from poor developing countries. And so those migrant workers, they may face being poorly paid and have fewer social protection and labor rights in comparison with their domestic counterparts. And so this also increased the risk of labor and labor abuses and trafficking. And they're particularly vulnerable to slavery and human trafficking because of conditions that are inherent to the fishing sector. For example, the fact that at sea it's escape from a fishing vessel is difficult or often actually impossible. They are isolated and distant from the regulatory agencies, and also sometimes because they are migrants and they don't have the relevant documentation, they will actually avoid contact with any sort of police or regulatory agencies. So that really decrease their chance of being able to voice any issues. And then the last point, and probably the most important one, is that in a lot of places, they may not be the effective protection against abuses. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this framework. So Aaron, if we can move to the slide on legal gaps. So when it comes to legal gaps in the fishing sector, the first one is the legal framework in itself. In general, labor regulation and trade unions are still weak in much of the global south, where a lot of seafood we eat is sourced. And so it means that there are also legal gaps in the fishing sector itself. When it comes to international regulation on for workers on fishing vessels, the key treaty is the ILO Convention C188, the Work in Fishing Convention. I will let the other panelists talk to you a little bit more about this because they know way more than I do about this key regulation. But unfortunately, very few countries have ratified it or even implemented it. But again, because we believe that labor and human rights abuses are linked to sustainability issues, we also think that it's key for countries to ratify other treaties that are not necessarily linked to labor, but in itself can bring more protection to workers. And so that's, for example, the IMO Cape Town Agreement on fishing vessel safety and the FAO Port State Measure Agreement, which relates to inspection of vessels to combat illegal fishing. And by ratifying the ILO Convention and these two other treaties, this increased opportunities for vessel inspection in port, and so opportunities for workers to voice in case of labor abuses. Another area of the fishing sector that is not regulated enough, or where there are legal gaps, is when it comes to transshipments at sea. So the transfer of goods at sea, including seafood. And so the lack of regulation on monitoring of these transshipments means that they can sometimes facilitate the transfer of illegal fish. And unfortunately also sometimes they can traffic victims on fishing vessels for years because they never get the opportunity of going back to shore. Another important legal gaps is also when it comes to the use of flags of convenience in the fishing sector. Flag states should on paper only register vessels that have a genuine link with them, but unfortunately in the fishing sector and in other sectors as well, but some states allow vessels to gain a flag using a paper-based sort of shell company without making sure that this company has any assets or real presence in the country. So it means that those flags of convenience, they facilitate anonymous ownership of vessels, and this means that there is a lack of transparency that hinders the work of law enforcement officers to actually be able to identify and then prosecute the real owner of a vessel and people who benefit from operation of illegal fishing and human trafficking. Moving on to the next slide about enforcement gaps. In addition to legal gaps, there's sometimes a lack of enforcement due to cost. In some cases, the initial upgrades to fisheries management strategies can result in the doubling or even tripling of cost because of the necessary investments you need to make in the early stages. And so a lot of countries will not have the resources to really upgrade their fisheries management strategies and means. Sometimes it's because of security or safety concerns. Officers on the ground who have successfully exposed or prosecuted traffickers might fear for their own safety if they follow through with their investigation, and we've seen this happening in some countries. And also observers on board the fishing vessels themselves, they may also have concern for their safety, and so it's not an incentive for them to report cases of human rights abuses. And then in a lot of countries, it's just a general lack of will. Some countries just fail to see that the short-term cost increases due to stronger regulation and enforcement will yield sustained and long-term benefits thanks to sustainably managed fisheries and adequate labor standards. Some governments may also be reluctant to increase labor rights and control over recruitment agencies because many fishers are migrants, and so they don't have a voting rights, and so such actions may not be seen as a political advantage for them. And then at the operational level, fisheries enforcement officials are not always aware of the human rights abuses on board fishing vessels or even cases of trafficking, and they can sometimes see it as something that is outside of the scope of their mandate to investigate, because they're focusing, for example, on fisheries rather than human and crew. Moving on to the slide on recommendation. So again, EGF, we are an advocacy-focused organization, and most of our recommendations are directed to states rather than the private sector. And so, again, going back to the vicious cycle, we think that one very effective way of helping stop labor abuses and human rights abuses on board fishing vessels would be to stop overfishing and illegal fishing. And to do that, we are prioritizing increasing transparency in the fishing sector, because over the years we've realized that the opacity of the sector means that it's very difficult to identify vessels, to understand their activities and understand what is the ownership behind these vessels. So through increasing transparency, we would have a chance to actually stop illegal fishing, and then in the long run, kind of kill that enabling environment for labor abuses on board fishing vessels. So that's our overall goal as an organization. But of course, then there are obviously other measures that can be taken that are specific to labor issues. And so, for example, it could be related to giving an appropriate legal mandate, training and support. States must, first of all, acknowledge the nature and scale of labor and human rights abuses in their fishing sectors, and then implement a robust legal framework. And that obviously includes the ratification of the ILO Convention C188, but also any other ILO instruments that are relevant to labor. It can relate to the regulating recruitment process and brokers, because again, brokers play a significant role in the fishing sector. So they should be more regulated, and we should ensure that all brokers are actually held accountable. And then there should be greater resources that are dedicated to combating human trafficking and human rights abuses, and to just do more prevention and investigation. And states should also foster interagency collaboration and cooperation. And then my last slide relates to what industry can do. There's a lot of work that is being done for when it comes to due diligence in supply chains. As an organization, we have developed 2 guides specific to retailers, but also processors and importers, on how to make sure that their supply chain are free of illegally sourced products, but also labor. I think the general idea is that industry should not just rely on states to combat illegal fishing and labor abuses, and their lack of action will actually undermine efforts that are being made by governments, and they can't just rely on certification schemes, so they need to adopt their own risk mitigation measures. And so I would be very happy to share the guides that EGF has developed on these specific issues, and it comes with a lot of recommendations when it comes to identifying areas and operations that are more at risk of labor violations, and plenty of other advice about recording sufficient data on sourcing vessels, raising awareness, but also make sure that retailers and other elements of the supply chain only work with suppliers that have system in place and are actually monitoring their fishing vessels. So that is it for me, and I'll be happy to take a question at the end of all the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was excellent overview, and very interesting to see commentary there about people feeling, officials being fearful of reporting cases in some instances because of security risks of their own lives, which just illustrates the complexity of it. Never mind the fishermen themselves, the crew, if they're under cases of abuse, you know, how confident would they be in terms of putting these stories forward, which I suppose is a very good in-way to our next speaker. Aaron, perhaps if you can just slip onto this, the next slide. So our next speaker today, if I ask Rosenn if he can just turn his camera on for the beginning of his, just for now while I introduce him, and then we'll turn it off during his presentation. So Rosenn Karavatchev has worked in the Maritime Department of the International Transport Workers Federation in London since 2004. And he has special emphasis on the political work programs of the fisheries and inland navigation sections. He represents the ITF and lobbies for and promotes the ITF maritime campaigns and positions to external bodies, including relevant United Nations agencies like the ILO, the FAO, and the IMO, and other intergovernmental organizations and major NGOs. He was actively involved in the process of adoption of the IOLL Work and Fishing Convention, which Sophie mentioned, and the follow-up activities on its promotion, its ratification and implementation. Originally from Bulgaria, Rosenn graduated from the Bulgarian Naval Academy with an MSc in navigation in 1982. He holds a captain's certificate for ocean-going ships of up to 3,000 gross tons, in addition to a college diploma in applied mathematics and a postgraduate diploma in general law and public administration. So I'm very excited to have Rosenn speak to us today, because not many outside of the maritime and transport sector are aware of the work of the ITF, which is essentially the strongest trade union federation in the world. Rosenn will be explaining more to us, but from my conversations with him, it appears that the protection of seafarers is generally well funded and well established at ITF with various ITF inspectors, but the fishery section is comparatively much smaller, and he will go into more detail on that. But all of this presents a very good opportunity for the ITF to get more involved and represent fishermen across the world. So now, Rosenn, I'll hand over to you, and I'll turn my camera off. Great. Rosenn, I think you're on mute. Just to unmute yourself. Yeah, there we go.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being invited to speak to you. And I'll switch my cell phone in order to see the presentation. Generally, our mission is to promote decent work for fishers, and then at the same time to promote safety in at sea on board the fishing vessels, and this combined with the work against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Can you go to the next slide? Actually, we're the International Trade Union Global Federation. In fact, we're the oldest one in existence, officially since 1896. If you're not in the trade union movement, think something like Greenpeace of the trade unions. We're the most powerful and the most financially sound international organization, represent 20 million transport workers. We're known in the merchant marine and the merchant shipping for running the campaign against the flag of convenience since 1948. We are the only international trade union to negotiate and sign collective bargaining agreements. For the time being, we have 13,000 ships out of 50,000 in the world involved in international merchant shipping. As a result of that, we represent 900,000 seafarers. And as you see, we're not so good in the representing the fishers working on board industrial fishing vessels. We have just 100,000 fishers as members of our affiliate and few hundred ships under ITF agreement. We're based all across the world. Our headquarters are in London for the last 8 years. While we're having regional offices, and one of the smaller offices, which is not shown here, is the Hong Kong Flag of Convenience office. Can you turn to the next? What we find in the marine catch or ocean-going fisheries is, it's a matter of fact, this is the most dangerous industry in the world. The trafficking of persons, piracy, child labor, modern slavery is widespread, as is the illegal fishing and the fishing operators involved in IUU fishing is also widespread. Somewhere between 25 and 50% of the marine catch activities are linked to the illegal fishing. We have found over the years that quite a wide variety of human rights violation takes place on board of high sea fisheries, where the crew and the people are deprived of basic freedoms and they face extreme exploitation. There is obvious evidence that they're overworked, poorly paid, badly paid, or without wages. They work on board in the region of Asia on encounters for 2 or 3 years. Some of them never see the shore during the duration of their contracts. And we are working with different organizations to address the issue, occasionally Interpol, Organization of Migration, and of course the ILO UN agency. Next slide. Aaron, can you go over? Yeah. What is our main focus? We are trying to help and organize and represent the industrial fishers, which are out of 40 million. We can say there is a 4 to 5 million fishers in the world working on bigger fishing vessels. We're trying to secure and ensure that the fisheries activities are run in a legal form and are regulated, and we have found over the years that the violation of labor and human rights is going hand to hand with the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. That's the reason we're combating the IUU fishing as strong as possible. We are, as trade union, we're running a non-stop campaign on the promotion of certification and implementation of the ILO Working Fishing Convention 188. We're trying to reduce the use of casual and forced labor, and we're doing so through the running dedicated national and regional organizing projects like we did in Papua New Guinea years ago. We're quite actively involved in organizing projects in Thailand at the moment, with the view of expanding to the region of Southeast Asia. In Europe, we have projects in Ireland and Spain, and we are in the process of just beginning of several years project in West Africa. Since we're best known in the world for running the flag of convenience campaign through the network of several hundred inspectors and contacts, we have a similar but much smaller fishery support inspectorate network in different parts and regions of the world. And we're trying to do our best to neutralize anti-union practices from some or majority of transnational companies, seafood companies. And we are working together with sister organization and trade unions to organize workers across the fisheries industry supply chain. We have dedicated web page, and going to the next slide. What we recommend, as our colleague from EGF mentioned, there's some big difference what the EGF and ITF are preaching for. We're similar in size, slightly different focus. I admit that there are much better media effective in fisheries, but in general we're working and recommend full transparency through the supply chain. We are working and want to have a clear identification of ship owners, operators and ships. For the time being, just to give you the numbers, we're speaking about 25,000 ships which are on the global record of fishing vessels, and the number of ships, fishing vessels involved in industrial fisheries in the high seas, by some estimates of the FAO, are 176,000 ships worldwide. So there is quite a lot of work to be done to identify the vessels involved. Of course, as trade union, we're working hard on and recommend ratification and implementation of the Working Fishing Convention. We believe that effective regulation is vital, and strong coordination among the UN agency dealing with fisheries is needed, like the ILO, IMO, and FAO. And as a result of that, once we have enough acceptance of international standards to use the different port state control mechanism of the port state control for merchant ship of the IMO and the port state control and the labor inspection of the ILO, to be linked with the per state measures agreement and per state measures control of the FAO. We believe that it's need all the stakeholders involved, and because it's quite a difficult industry, and the NGOs, so environment is not enough, the trade union is not enough, the social society, civil society is not enough, so everybody has to cooperate. And as trade union, we're speaking about and promoting enforcement through the collective bargaining agreement, and as such, we have developed a model collective bargaining agreement for fishers worldwide, which is adapted for the different regions, Europe, Africa, Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosenn. It's very, very useful to know more about the work of the ITF. As I mentioned, not many people outside of the maritime space and transport space are aware of your work. And I see huge potential here for the fishing industry to work closer with the ITF and get more representation amongst their fishing crew and the associated trade unions that you work with around the world. So Aaron, perhaps if we can just skip to the next slide so I can introduce our next speaker. And also just to encourage everyone, if you have questions for Sophie at EGF or Rosenn at ITF, please do put it into the chat box. There's a little chat function you'll see there. You can put your question there and Aaron will read it out at the end of our, after our final speaker today. Good. Okay, so our third speaker today is Birgitte Krogh-Poulsen, and she's an independent social development specialist at Poulson Consulting. Birgitte has over 20 years of global experience in social development and human rights work, mostly in Europe, Africa, and Asia. She started her own consulting business in 2010, and she runs it out of her home country in Denmark. She has previously worked for NIRAS Consulting Engineers and for the International Labour Organization. She's lived and worked in several countries, including India, Tanzania, Thailand, and Zambia. And Birgitte specializes in the elimination of child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking, and works also in the related fields of child protection, access to education, and gender equality. She works extensively with different stakeholders in the seafood industry to promote socially sustainable seafood. And in addition, she works on studies, strategic planning, and policy formulation with governments and other partners around the world, such as her current work in support of national action plans to eliminate forced labor and child labor in Malaysia. In addition to her consulting assignments, she serves on several advisory committees and boards. So with her wealth of experience in this space, I'll now hand over to Birgitte, who will talk to us about these issues and take us through some of the approaches to tackle this down our seafood supply chains. Thanks, Birgitte.
Thank you, Jacqui, for the extensive introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be with you today. I will also turn off my camera as I start to go through my presentation, which is going to take you through a little bit more information on drivers, building on what Sophie and Rosenn have also shared, and looking at analysing and understanding risks and taking action in seafood supply chains. So let's get started. I'll stop sharing. I think before I'm going to zero in on forced labour here. And so I think before we dive into the contents or further contents, I would really like to just share with you what I would say is the internationally agreed definition of forced labour. And it's contained in an ILO convention that some of you probably, or all of you are probably familiar with, ILO Convention 29 on forced labour. It defines forced labour as work and services that are exacted from a person under the menace of a penalty for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. And obviously there's more to the entire framework around forced labour than just this convention. And I've just highlighted also ILO Convention 105 and the protocol to Convention 29 that was adopted in 2014. But I think here I just want to highlight that forced labour is work that somebody is doing that he or she has not accepted to do, or that he or she has been lured into or coerced into, and that he or she cannot leave again because there is the menace of a penalty. And the menace of a penalty can be many things. It can be, it can be withholding of salaries. It can be the threat of violence. It can be actual physical violence. It can be the threat of violence to somebody's family members or community. Forced labour is a criminal offence in most countries around the world. And there is an increasing recognition that responsibility for occurrence of forced labour in supply chains extends through supply chains. So more and more countries are actually adopting legislation to say there is chain responsibility for forced labour and child labour too, for that matter, but we can talk about that some other day. Yeah, let's move on, Erin. Thank you. Forced labour doesn't come out of the blue, and I think that's abundantly clear from what Sophie and Rosenn have already talked about. But I really do want to highlight that very often forced labour is associated with poverty. And you have a situation where poverty might limit opportunities for families and individuals, and that makes them more vulnerable to poverty. They're more likely to accept a dodgy offer if it's difficult to make ends meet. And then the effects of forced labour, again, will further deprive families and individuals of opportunities. There's lost opportunities in missing education. There is ill health caused by the effects of forced labour. People who have been rescued from forced labour, certainly on board fishing vessels, and have been reintegrated back into their families and communities in their home countries, very often suffer ill health, post-traumatic stress, all of these things that will make them less able to actually find, decent work when they come home and reintegrate fully socially and economically. That perpetuates poverty. And in turn, it limits the opportunities. And what you see is sometimes you see an intergenerational poverty cycle that interplays with forced labour. Having said that, though, poverty is not the only driver of forced labour. There is no automatic, if you eliminate poverty, forced labour will go away. That's not how it works, unfortunately. So I want to just look a little bit more of some of the other drivers, and I have to stress that this isn't a complete picture at all. I'm just trying to highlight some of the mechanisms that we find are quite common. And yeah, let's move on. I will do it quickly because I think Sophie and Rosenn have, in fact, already said most of this. But what you often see also is that in a situation where poverty is prevalent, that doesn't necessarily cause forced labour all on its own. Often it interplays with situations of social marginalisation and attitudes that foster discriminatory practices. So if you have a mix of poverty and of acceptance of inequality and social marginalisation, what you see is that you will sometimes come across discriminatory practices towards certain groups of workers then. For example, migrant workers or workers from ethnic minorities. And that can drive a situation of unfair labour practices where where there's a narration that migrant workers don't really need the same protections as everybody else, or people from a certain ethnic minority don't really need the same fair labour conditions as everybody else. And that can pave the way for forced labour. Similarly, on the next slide, you might find a situation where there is a narration that migrant workers are, they're better off working here with us than they would be with no work at home. And so it's all right that they're giving a lower wage. It's okay to pay migrant workers less than other workers. It's all right, maybe, or there's a perception that it's all right that migrant workers don't have the same contracts that they're recruited through dodgy recruitment agents, that they work for longer hours than other workers. And you start cutting corners for migrant workers, again paving the way for potential forced labour. So forced labour is the far end of a slippery slope in a sense. It doesn't just happen out of nothing. Lots of things happen before forced labour materialise. Very specifically on the next slide for the seafood industry, I'm going to just remind you a little bit about what Sophie was talking about. That, Erin, if you could change to the next slide, please. Yes, that environmental degradation and overfishing, specifically in the seafood industry, the factors that I've been talking about till now are really quite common in multiple sectors. They're not seafood specific, but specifically for the seafood industry, we have this vicious cycle that Sophie was talking about. The environmental degradation, the overfishing, the illegal fishing that leads to a decline in fish stocks, that leads to dwindling profits and cutting corners on crew costs, paving the way again for forced labour. And let's move on quickly because we've already been through this quite extensively. Now, obviously, a problem of forced labour, which is a criminal offence, which occurs across the world, merits action. But how do you deal with a problem that has multiple drivers that may look different in different parts of the world, that may look different in different countries within a region of the world, that may even look different in different locations within within one country, that where multiple risk factors play together and make people vulnerable to forced labour, and where these things happen at multiple levels? How do you deal with that? Or in other words, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you do that one bite at a time. You can't swallow the elephant whole. So this means that multiple actors must work together, and not everyone should do the same thing. Different actors should do different things that are within their mandate and within their expertise and within their realm, if you like. The important point, of course, is that all strategies that all these different actors put together must all promote decent work, which is defined in ILO Convention 188 that Rosenn was talking about. So let's look at the next slide. Now, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and I borrowed this slide, I have to say, from the European Parliament, is a framework that specifies what actors have responsibility for what kinds of actions. And it's abundantly clear that state actors have the responsibility to protect individuals, protect people from human rights abuses, including forced labour. And state actors must do this by putting in place legislation, regulation, adjudication mechanisms, policies that promote the fulfillment of human rights, and in this case, promote the elimination of forced labour. Now, this also is important from the point of view of businesses operating in a level playing field. It's important that businesses have to abide by similar legislation no matter where they operate. And that, of course, is particularly important when you look at fishing from the point of view of flag states that Rosenn and Sophie were also talking about, that we don't have different standards for different businesses operating in different territories, because that, of course, means that some people can undercut other people. Now, states have this responsibility to protect individuals and to put in place the legislative policy framework that regulates everybody else's behavior. Businesses have the responsibility to respect this framework and to protect and respect human rights across their supply chains, no matter what part of the supply chain. And this means that businesses must act with due diligence and address the adverse impacts. Victims have a right to remedy. They have a right to actually receive support and remedial, judicial remediation in cases where they do get trapped, for example, in forced labour. Let's go to the next slide. So how do businesses then act with due diligence and address the adverse impact of operations to make sure that human rights are respected across the supply chain, to make sure there is no forced labor? The first step is to understand the risks. It's very difficult to deal with a beast that you do not understand. So businesses need to know what kind of risks they are in fact facing throughout their supply chains. And I'm really excited now to share snippets of an upcoming tool with you. The Seafood Slavery Risk Tool is a joint initiative by the Monterey Bay Aquarium in Seafood Watch Program, the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and Liberty Shared, which is an NGO that primarily works with financial sector businesses. And version 2 of the risk tool is in a sort of final stage of development and will be launched later this year. And the idea behind this risk tool is that we would like to give businesses better understanding of the risks of forced labor, human trafficking, and hazardous child labor in different seafood systems, in different systems where different seafood products are produced. So let's just go to the next slide, and I'm going to give you a super quick intro to this. There's a conceptual model behind the Seafood Slavery Risk Tool. And the tool itself has been developed over the course of the last, well, actually almost 2 years, based on extensive reviews of available literature. And we've identified different levels that may impact the risk of forced labor, human trafficking, and hazardous child labor in different seafood supply chains. And essentially, what we are basing our tool on is an understanding that at country and regional level, there are systemic risks that impact the seafood industry. So that, for example, could be flagging legislation or flagging systems. But it's also wider than that. It's general labor legislation, it's general poverty figures, it's general education figures in a given country, for example. And lots of this might be completely outside the control of individual seafood businesses, but nevertheless, it shapes the way in which a business can operate and produce or trade or sell seafood products. And then there are factors at the wider seafood industry level, and we consider the seafood inherently risky for all the reasons, in fact, that Rosenn already shared with you. That you have lots of vulnerable workers, you have weak legislation, you have a lack of transparency. What goes on at sea stays at sea, for example. And then what we also think is that within this inherently risky environment, certain seafood systems might be more risky than others because they might take place or the production of the seafood might take place in areas where just legislation is weaker, for example, or the enforcement of legislation is particularly weak because there's limited capacity or a whole range of other reasons. And so the goal that we've set up for ourselves is to try and identify specific parts of the seafood systems where there's a particularly pronounced risk of forced labor, human trafficking, and hazardous child labor. So in effect, what we want to do is provide a jigsaw puzzle picture of what risk might look like in different parts of the world, bearing in mind that some of the risks are general and some of them are specific to specific parts of the world. Let's go further to the next slide. So we use a set of indicators to identify these risks, and we have indicators at country level. There are 42 of them altogether, and they look at issues like poverty levels, regional economic development, trends, migration patterns, things like this. We also look at the seafood industry in a wider sense. For example, is there specific legislation regulating labor conditions or migrant workers' conditions in the seafood industry in a given country? And then we look at processing, fishery, and aquaculture farming specific indicators like workforce characteristics. And all of that should lead to this jigsaw puzzle picture of, you know, what are the different risk patterns for the production of, say, tropical tuna, which is our first pilot seafood system in different countries around the world. Let's move on. So, because I really, before we end, would like to share with you this particular slide on, so what can businesses do once you know the risk? Because that's obviously only the starting point. And I think the first and most important message really is that everybody must make forced labor their own business. This is the first point of call. Recognize that forced labor is everybody's business. And it might be that you don't see forced labor in your own business. It might be that it's not apparent in your supply chain, but you really, really do need to recognize that it's real, that it exists, and that there is a risk of forced labor in very many seafood supply chains. And therefore, forced labor and other human rights issues can't just be, you know, an add-on that you can deal with as an afterthought. It has to be the response to forced labor. The understanding of forced labor and other human rights issues must be integrated with the governance structures of a business. And it must be an integral part to sourcing decisions, for example, to understand, so what are the risks of forced labor and how can we mitigate that risk in our sourcing decisions, for example, in the way that we deal with our suppliers. And the first step, of course, is to map supply chains. We hope that the Seafood Slavery Risk Tool will help businesses with a strong starting point for mapping supply chains and understanding the specific risks in their own supply chains. Also, I think making public human rights commitments and reporting is a really, really important point. It might seem like a symbolic thing to do, but it actually, the minute you've said in public, this is my business, you've made it your business and you do have to act on it. It's very difficult to act on something that you don't really understand. So therefore, training for staff on risks and remedies, on human rights issues in general, forced labor issues in this particular case, is essential. Also, this will allow staff to engage with your suppliers, not just writing clauses into contracts to say we do not accept forced labor in the, you know, whatever it is that we're sourcing from you, but also engaging in a meaningful conversation. Some of these issues are really, really delicate, quite sensitive issues. If you want to have a conversation about something as insidious as attitudes to migrant workers, for example, it has to be brought up in a meaningful way, in a sensitive way very often. And that is a lot easier if you have education on it, if you have a solid understanding. Now, I don't want to belabor this point because Rosenn already talked about it, but promoting freedom of association and collective bargaining really is important because it's the thing that will give your, you know, workers throughout the supply chain a voice and a chance to engage in this and to become active on these issues. And for businesses to be able to deal with it, they need active, engaged workers to actually collaborate with on ending forced labor. And also businesses very often need to engage with each other in pre-competitive dialogue. And in very many cases also with governments to make sure that the governments put in place the right legislation, the right policies to create this level playing field that I was talking about before, to make sure that all the businesses that are engaged in rooting out forced labor from supply chains play by the same rule book. And so it's a multitude of different activities that have to take place together. But the core thing is, of course, that it has to be an essential part of the DNA of doing business. Whether you're a seafood producer, a seafood trader, a retailer, or a food service industry that sells seafood to consumers. And with that, I think we're well into question time, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you want to get a hold of me afterwards, Erin, if you want to get a hold of me afterwards, you're most welcome to reach out. I'd be delighted to hear from you. LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Birgitte. That was excellent. And your 8 points there on what businesses can do, I think are going to be very useful guidance for us and for our members and for others in the industry in Asia. I'm just going to ask all the speakers if they can just put their cameras on now. Aaron, you let us know if the bandwidth is getting affected and we can turn them off. But I think it's nice during the question and answers that we can see everyone. Great. So we've had quite a few questions come in. And this one is not at anyone in particular, but Sophie did mention flags of convenience, I think, and also Rosenn, you talked about your flags of convenience campaign. And the question is, or the comment first, is that flags of convenience has been mentioned when talking about the fishing industry, suggesting that fishing boats operate under them. Is it not more common for transshipment, bunker and service vessels to operate under them, which means seafood buyers must consider these supply chain risks as well? So what approach would you suggest then to apply in this regard?
Thank you very much, and Rosenn, please feel free to fill in at any point. So yes, the use of flag of convenience is rampant both by fishing vessels themselves, but also with other vessels that do fishing related activities like refrigerated cargo vessels. You have a lot of reefers that are flagged to countries like Panama, for example, or Liberia, which are considered as flags of convenience by the ITF, so Rosenn's organization. And also all related vessels for bunkering, for example, as it was mentioned. I think that as someone trying to keep an eye on their supply chain, there are a lot of different approaches that you could take. You could have a very strong policy and decide that actually you don't want any single vessel in your supply chain to be associated with flags of convenience. That would be a very strong approach, or otherwise something a little bit more measured that could be done. It's just that any vessels that you are aware are flagged to an FOC, to a flag of convenience, is just to be put on a higher risk vessel list. And so it means that you would need to apply more due diligence when it comes to those vessels. So that could be an approach, I guess.
Okay, very good. And Rosenn, I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that. Are you on mute, I think, again, Rosenn? Just need to unmute yourself.
Actually, I have a little bit some concerns. The flag of convenience, as it is in merchant shipping, is a system developed by the ITF itself, and it does not apply fully to the fishing vessels and the flag which allow the fishing vessel to register. I'm strongly campaigning in my organization to create a separate register for fishing vessels. And then on top of that, there is a FAO list of flag of convenience for fishing vessels, which they did years ago, but it's need updating, which may be good, because I'm saying we are a trade union, we can get in trouble trying to enforce international standards. FAO is the place to go. And in addition, because I'm saying that, for example, Sierra Leone in the past and Togo are not listed as merchant shipping of flag convenient registers. And I'm strong supporter, and I would like to campaign and to see our organization and the others actually to stop the transshipment at sea. Whatever we say, that even if you keep observers or electronic cameras, the abuse is taking place if the vessels stay at sea for 2-3 years. So better to have the fishing vessels to be able to come to port and to be seen, and the transshipment at sea by reefers to happen only in extremely limited cases on strong rules. this is the way to, from my opinion, to go forward. And that's what years ago I suggested to Greenpeace, instead of locking and getting areas where there is no fishing, to campaign for transshipment block. That's my view.
Very, very interesting view there, Rosenn, and yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've got another question for Rosenn, because you didn't talk about the global record of vessels. The low number of fishing vessels on that record was mentioned. So what steps can seafood buyers and supply chain owners take to increase the number of vessels on that global record? And if any of the other speakers have a comment on that, then please also go ahead.
If you ask me, at the end of the day, somewhere in the procedure, it has to be written that only vessels which are registered should come from vessels which are registered, and one of the way to be registered, they have to be on the database of IMO, the global record of fishing vessels. This is the way to go, and this is the way eventually, finally, to get mass cover, extended coverage. I'm saying it's going for 13 years now. The FAO started the campaign. It was picked up by the IMO. A lot of resolutions and actions are taking place at the IMO to increase the list of the registered vessels, but much more needed to be done, and this is one of the ways to be done from the consumers and from the companies which are can actually control. I mentioned the figure 176,000 vessels, which is FAO figure of about the vessels which are either 100 gross tons or 24 meters and above. And then Lloyd's register, which is doing the work for the IMO global record, they're going very slow, starting from 25,000 vessels years ago and approaching maybe at the moment 30,000. If they're limited, some data is missing, we're speaking that they have on the record 40,000 vessels. But in order to make sure, pressure has to be applied from consumers or from the big multinational companies to make sure that, and this is the only way to have transparency and traceability.
So that's a clear role, I think, for buyers of seafood to be asking that then of their suppliers who have that source access to the fisheries. Yeah. Can those vessels be on the list? Yeah, okay, very clear. Thanks, Rosenn. And I'm going to pass this question on to Birgitte. The next question is, third-party certification of fisheries and aquaculture is widely used in the industry. If we buy certified seafood, does it guarantee the seafood is slavery and human rights risk-free?
I think the short answer to that is a no. But I also do think that certification is a tool in the toolbox that can be useful for some things. So I do quite a bit of work with the Global Aquaculture Alliance, including related to their best aquaculture practices certification. And last year, the BAP, the Best Aquaculture Practices, contracted the Royal Tropical Institute in the Netherlands to do an impact assessment. So they asked the Royal Tropical Institute to assess whether the social clauses in the BAP certification scheme had any impact on the way in which producers produce seafood and had any impact on the working conditions and the livelihoods of workers. And they did, they analyzed a lot of data that was available, and then they did interviews in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and in Chile with aquaculture farmers and workers in aquaculture plants. And one of the conclusions that they drew was it has an impact, because what it does is that certification is one tool to start systematically looking at systems in businesses. So it gives a framework for a business to address in a systematic way social issues and human rights issues within that business. But jumping to the, jumping from there to saying that it's a guarantee that there's going to be no child labour or no forced labour, I don't think that wouldn't hold water in it by any stretch. And I don't think there's any system that will ever guarantee that there is going to be no forced labour or child labour in a product. No, there's no silver bullet. It doesn't exist. It's about using multiple tools and working with multiple partners to reduce the risk, to mitigate the risk, to address the underlying drivers of this in a systematic way. So I hope that was kind of an answer.
No, I think that's it's a perfect answer to say it's not the only thing, but it's certainly part of the solution, a very important part of the solution. And I think I did see that a lot myself when looking at certification down the seafood supply chain of the previous company I worked for. Just asking for information, having that documentation flow in itself helped to organize that supplier and provide that certain information, making it available. Okay, I think we've actually run out of time, and unfortunately I had some more questions for all three of you, but I think given that we've run out of time, any other questions for our speakers, I would welcome members and others to send them to us and we can distribute them to our speakers, continue the conversation. We will be putting this recording onto the HKSSC website along with the slides. So please do get in touch at any point. And the next webinar will be species specific. We are looking to organize that for August, and that we're going to be focusing in on tuna. So do sign up for that when it's available. And I would just like to say a big thank you to Sophie, Rosenn, and Birgitte for giving us your time this morning and just educating us and helping to further guide us on areas of importance, be it state level, industry level, and then how practically we can start achieving. So thanks everyone for your time, and thanks Aaron as well. Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll just sign out here, Aaron.
Thank you all.
Thank you to everybody.
Okay, cheers, bye.
Bye-bye. Just click. No, just end.